Welcome to AP European History. We're in Unit 7. Today we're launching into the new imperialism. This will probably be part 1 of 2, covering from 1880 to 1914. This is a pivotal period in world history because it's here that Europe once again takes to their ships and with their guns goes out and conquers a huge portion of the world and puts it under their control. It's what historians like to call the new imperialism, as opposed to the old imperialism. And in this one, we'll also be talking about one of the areas that impacted most deeply, Africa. So let's get right into it. First of all, let's review. What is this old imperialism? What do the historians call the old imperialism? So they're talking about before Napoleon, what did that look like? And this is kind of where we started the course, talking about the Age of Discovery, from 1400 to roughly 1800, involving primarily 5 countries: Portugal, Spain, France, Great Britain, and Netherlands. And as they focused primarily on North and South America and trade with the East, in particular trade around the Indian Ocean, trade along the African coast. That's kind of what the old imperialism looks like. It was, if you recall, the Portuguese had begun the whole thing by trying to find their way around Africa, going down the west coast of Africa until they finally did get around. Columbus was trying to find his way to the Indies by traveling west. He discovered North and South America, and that created these vast new empires these primarily 5 countries. But by the mid-1800s, after Napoleon, Great Britain is the last real empire from this era. The Spanish had lost theirs right after the Napoleonic Wars. If you recall, all of those places like Mexico, Argentina, had declared independence against Spain and had gotten their independence. France had lost most of its empire to wars with the British in the 1700s. The Netherlands had lost most of their empire. They did have some outposts in various parts of the world. But Great Britain is still holding strong. They still have a lot. They are still the great empire of the world by the mid-1800s. That's about to change as other countries are going to enter the game. So if we look at 1822, right after Napoleon, this map shows clearly the great empires and the location of those empires. So anything in red is controlled by the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland. You can see Canada was still there, Australia, India, parts of Africa along the coast, and a few other outposts in various places. France had some outposts along the African coasts, as did Portugal, as did Spain, and the Netherlands, of course, controlled over in the Indies. The United States at that point, no real empire. Russia did not have an overseas empire. Turkey, or the Ottomans, had a large empire. In terms of the European area, they were the second largest of the empires of that time. So let's move on and see how that changes. So what is this new imperialism? What makes it different? There are certainly elements that are the same. A lot of the sameness is built upon the technological advantages Europeans had in conquering these areas, some of the patterns of conquest. But it's a much smaller time period, from about 1880, maybe back to 1870 to World War I, and it involves a lot more countries. Some of the same players: Great Britain, France, Portugal, but now there's some new players in this game, as new countries that didn't even exist before in the old imperialism, they're now there. Italy, Germany get in it. Belgium, which was a brand new country. Russia, Japan, the only non-European country to get involved in this, and ultimately the United States, if you recall, in the 1890s, jumps into it as well, with the Spanish-American War, acquiring the Philippines, Puerto Rico, liberating Cuba, Guam, etc. What it means is, in this short period of time, Europe takes over about 10 million square miles and about 1/5 of world population. This is the era of the scramble for Africa. Africa, when this started, going back to that map, there was just a few places controlled by Europeans, and mostly those were small outposts for trade. By the end of this time period, there's only one independent country, well, two if you count Liberia, 2 independent countries in all of Africa. The rest of it had been taken over by these countries. This is also the era where there's a renewed interest in East Asia, not so much in taking it over, but in opening it to European trade in order to make as much money from East Asia as possible. So you're not going to see large settlements of Europeans in Japan or China, but there will be forcible efforts to open the trade in those areas. And in some parts of East Asia, like in Indochina, Southeast Asia, there will be French settlements in places like Vietnam. What it means, again, kind of the big picture, the Europeans are using less colonies and less settlements. You don't have a bunch of pilgrims going to India and establishing a whole new place and then displacing natives. Instead, the natives, by and large, stay exactly where they are. They're not moving. They're not being pushed out. They're not being killed. They might be pushed out of certain areas, especially the good areas. They might be pushed out of the ownership, but they're going to still there. It's going to still be there. And by and large, one of the big changes is how these European countries administer these areas. Oftentimes, they leave local officials, local kings, local clan leaders. They'll leave them in control and use them as puppets to control the territory. So it looks like things really haven't changed, but really Europeans are now calling all the shots. India, for example, will be run by a very small number of English civil servants who will use local Indian leaders to control the entire subcontinent of India. Sometimes they'll even use protectorates, where a country will declare, oh, we're just protecting this area from other European countries, and we're not really manipulating or using them at all. It was just another way of leaving those local officials in control while Europeans called the shots and made the money. All right, so this is what it looks like by 1914. And you can see big changes. Just looking at it from our perspective, you see the American acquisition of the Philippines, some little islands. I'm not even sure if they show up out here. Over here, Samoa down here, Puerto Rico. So America has acquired an overseas empire. You see the French, who had a few little places. Now almost all of Northwest Africa has become French. Madagascar, French Indochina, as we talked about, what is now Vietnam, becomes theirs. Portugal has expanded the places they control. Africa is all divided up. Italy has expanded and taking its colonies. Russia is making efforts to, of course, expand against the Ottoman Empire, but they're also making efforts to expand in East Asia as well. And then the new players like Belgium, who takes this big chunk here in Africa. So things have changed a lot during this time. Africa is gone. British have, of course, expanded their holdings here, and there's not much left in the world that's not controlled by a small number of European countries, right? So let's talk about how that happens and why they thought that was okay. What were their rationalizations? How do they think it was okay to do this? And part of it, you just have to understand, for almost all of human history, countries have felt that it's okay to go and take over other people's stuff and take it as your own. That's just the way of the world. That the big lion kills the weak gazelle and eats it. That's just life. But Europeans had presumably become enlightened. They had become Christianized and enlightened. And so, what were they thinking? Well, one is this idea of just raw power, that European nations had become more powerful than they had ever been before, than anyone had ever been before. The Industrial Revolution, married to capitalism, had created these new nation states with utterly unprecedented power. That the per capita GDP, the production rate of the industries of these countries was unlike anything seen before. That you could crank out battleships, every year. And added to that was the rivalries between these nations. Those hadn't gone away after Napoleon. They were trying to keep a balance of power. But how do you balance out the British Empire? And there was a growing belief that to be a great power, you had to have an empire. Last year in APUS, we talked about A.T. Mahan's book about empires and naval power leading to national greatness. The Kaiser of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, became convinced that the only way for Germany to achieve true greatness, after they'd been unified, they're unified now, but they deserve a place in the sun. And to do that, they need an empire. And to have an empire, they have to have a fleet. And when they build that fleet, the British, for the first time, see Germany as a real threat. And again, a lot of these tensions are going to lead to World War I. This era of imperialism is one of the foundations to the debacle that is World War I. So countries like Germany are looking for a place in the sun. Italy's looking for its own little place in the Mediterranean sun. In addition, capitalism had created immense wealth. And if you look at any Marxist historian worth their salt, they're going to see this era as key to the development of kind of the Marxist worldview, that these nations had achieved immense wealth, that wealth was looking for ways to make more money. You need to find a new place to invest. That there was all the easy money was gone in Europe. So where's the easy money left? How about the rest of the world? At the same time, Europe was voracious for raw materials, for new things, and for a market to sell all the things that they were making. Marxists in general see imperialism as the last stage of capitalism before the revolution, and so they kind of welcome it. It's like, here's imperialism, yay, it's going to be the last part of it. Lenin himself said that imperialism is the monopoly state of capitalism, where capitalism ultimately, that the only end result of competition is a monopoly state where one nation controls all. And that is what leads ultimately to the revolution. At the same time, we haven't spent much time talking about this yet. We talked about it a lot last year. Science had moved very quickly from Darwin theories of natural selection to Spencer's idea of survival of the fittest. And there was a growing scientific consensus in Europe that races had developed, and peoples and ethnicities had developed out of competition between the nations, and that those nations that were most prosperous clearly must have been made up of races that were most evolved. And this idea of scientific racism, as noxious as it was widely accepted, not oftentimes challenged by scientists. So Europeans had this sense of, we are better than everyone else. Kipling described it as the white man's burden, that with this greatness, they have this obligation to go out and help others. They have an obligation to go to lesser races and show them how to do things, how to fix things. That clearly these other people didn't know what they were doing. We're more advanced, we're more evolved, and we need to show them how to proceed. Sometimes that was seen as and depicted as, and the people who felt it saw it as a truly compassionate effort to help other peoples, even though it came from a theoretical basis of essentially racism. They thought they were doing good, and oftentimes that was coupled with, or sometimes in competition with, a true Christian missionary zeal. As Christian missionaries went everywhere, it wasn't just Christian missionaries going out to change the world. It was missionaries of other ideas, idea missionaries, that, this is the way you should do these things. You should stop doing this. Stop doing the slavery stuff. We've evolved beyond slavery, and you need to as well. And it's probably, in terms of imperialistic rationales, that's probably the last one that really exists. Not the Christian missionary one, but the missionary ideals that Europeans and Westerners still want to export to the rest of the world and tell everyone how to live. And it's a strange paradox that oftentimes the people who are most anti-imperialist are most likely to try to tell other countries how they should live, even today. And in some cases, these colonial exploits were used as a deflection from domestic problems. We've got problems in our own country. The economy's bad, and the economy's going to get really bad in the late 1800s. You may remember talking about the panics in 1890 in America, that there will be severe dislocations. Well, why not distract people by going having a big war in another place and conquering it for the glory of your nation? Going and struggling against the barbarians in another land in order to bring them civilization. It distracts people from the fact that their prices of food keep going up. People who encountered Europeans had fairly typical responses. One of the most common responses was a violent one. That typically the response was, "Who are you? Why are you here? We don't want you here." And there'll be an effort to forcibly resist Europeans, whether it was in Abyssinia, what we know as Ethiopia, South Africa, China. There will be an effort to fight the Europeans. However, as this violent resistance was there, it was almost always unsuccessful because of the technological gap between the Europeans and the people they were conquering. The native people themselves felt deeply that it wasn't just their land being taken, but their way of life was under assault. Their culture is under assault. The Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese all, for a long time, deeply resisted European encroachment. They didn't even want to trade with Europeans because they felt like interaction with Europeans would change their culture in ways they could not predict, except that they felt that it would be in bad ways. This will also lead to divisions amongst local leaders in these areas about, well, how do we respond? We tried the violence, that didn't work. So what do? Do we turn deeper into a tradition? In Japan, you'll see this as the samurai will continue to try to hold on to their traditions. And the Japanese government was like, no, we're going to start building machine guns and we don't need the samurai anymore. So put on this type of clothing or we'll kill you. And there was actually a civil war within Japan between the traditionalists and the modernizers. The modernizers won because they had machine guns, not swords. And you see that in almost every place. This battle between traditionalists and modernizers. The Japanese ultimately kind of compromised on, we're going to modernize, but we're modernizing in order to protect our traditional way of life. Which meant, at the end of the day, they will change. And many places will send their elites to go be educated in other places, whether it's the United States or in Europe. In fact, a lot of the Japanese who America fought during World War II were educated in American colleges. And the great irony of all of this, of course, is European education, as it comes into these places, as these missionizers come in to say, hey, let's tell you how you should think. Well, the Enlightenment has taught us these ideas of civil rights and nationalism, that a people should have the right to run their own affairs. Yeah, that's what they should have the right to do. But we're running your affairs for you now because you're so stupid. And many of the people internalize this, and you'll see in many of the places that fight for independence from Europeans, they will put national in the name of their organization. Like in South Africa, it's called the African National Congress. In India, it was the Indian National Congress, because they were trying to create a nation of their own. An idea that Europeans had brought them when they made them into colonies. All right, so the big story we want to get to in today's lecture is the scramble for Africa. This is a famous illustration here on the right. The Rose Colossus striding from Cape Town to Cairo in Punch. Punch was a satirical magazine in London, a very famous magazine, as were its illustrations. This is the idea being that Cecil Rhodes, who was one of the English leaders in South Africa, who kind of had this dream of connecting English possessions from Egypt down to South Africa and building a railroad through that whole thing. Who also, the Rhodes Scholarship's named for him, and his statue is at Oxford or Cambridge, something like that. And there's a lot of people want to just tear it down because he was an imperialist. Well, anyway, so let's go way back in time to review a little bit. If you recall, it was the Portuguese who began those explorations along the coast of Africa because they were trying to get around Africa to get to the Indian Ocean and to get to all of the great trade products that they knew were in the Indies. Along the coast, naturally, they built trading posts to resupply their ships, and ultimately realizing, oh, Africans have some stuff we might want from them as well. So there'll be Portuguese trading posts and eventually French trading posts, and other nations. Dutch will put up trading posts all along the way. The Ottomans and Arabs also had trading posts on the East Coast, and oftentimes when the Europeans came in, they simply took over the Arabic trading posts and made them into European trading posts. Things like gold, ivory, diamonds, rubber, slaves up until 1815 will be major trade goods. But there's no need for Europeans to take over large pieces of land because the Africans were more than willing to bring those things to the trading post and trade them. So you don't see large settlements, with a few exceptions, South Africa being one of those. But so by 1880, only 10% of all of Africa was even under European control. 90% of it was independent, in many cases not even mapped. The interior of Africa by 1880 was not mapped. And some of the most famous people of this time period will be explorers of Africa. Anyway, so what was owned? Algeria was owned by France. South Africa, which had been owned by the Dutch, had been taken over by the British. And there'll be various other small outposts. In South Africa, there will be a long war between the Dutch and the English South Africans, the Dutch known as the Boers or Afrikaners, going from 1899 to 1902, and from there, the English will expand out of South Africa under Cecil Rhodes. And once they do, once the war is over, the Boer War is over, the Boers and the English decide, hey, why are we fighting each other? We need to be worried about Africans. And they'll create what's called a kind of a pre-apartheid system where basically if you were a black African, you could not own land and you could not vote. Only the Boers and English could. All right, so what happens next? So 1880, this is kind of before the scramble for Africa. You've got Algeria, you've got the British, you've got the Portuguese, the French, some French, and some other outposts along the coast. All these other colors here in the middle are independent countries. You've got the Ottomans, is the big green chunk over here. And that's it. A lot of it not mapped, not owned by anybody, just native peoples, native tribes doing their own thing. By 1913, right before the war, there's not much left that's independent. You've got Ethiopia, which had maintained its independence, and Liberia, which had maintained its independence because it was protected by the United States, and that's it. Everything else has been taken over. The United Kingdom had expanded this way and had been stopped from trying to connect north to south. They had acquired other things. The French, everyone else has come in and take chunks. The Germans do finally get their place in the sun by taking over colonies in Africa, which were not profitable at all and were a terrible idea for Germany, but they've got their empire. So what changed? Why was there a sudden scramble for Africa? Why did suddenly want to get it? Part of it is it was just set off by someone taking some chunks of it. And once a couple of European countries had taken some substantial chunks, other countries thought, oh, we better get in on that. It was kind of like, I don't even know. I don't have a good metaphor. But everybody's scrambling to get the last cookies on the plate because they'll soon all be gone. And part of it starts with Egypt. Egypt had a long history of an ancient empire up until 525 BC, and Alexander the Great shows up. The Greeks will rule it for a long time. Then the Arabs come in and take it. And then the Ottomans take it over, and it becomes part of the Ottoman Empire for a very long time. But the Ottoman Empire was falling apart when the Egyptian leader the Khedive becomes Muhammad Ali, who decides he's going to kind of carve out his own empire within the Ottoman Empire. Knowing that the Ottoman Sultan can't really do anything about it, he transforms Egypt by westernizing and modernizing. He's one of those who decides the way that Egypt can survive is becoming European. It became thousands of people and tens of millions of dollars poured into Egypt as it became a center of investment. People saw opportunities to make money there. Alexandria became a European city. 50,000 Europeans lived there by 1864. Everywhere you went, you heard European languages being spoken. Cotton became an important export in the Nile River Valley. By 1869, the Suez Canal opened, connecting the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. Now you didn't have to go around Africa to get to the Indian Ocean. You could go right through Egypt. It had been built by French engineers, with European investments. It was essentially a private enterprise designed to make money. England was probably the most interested in this because they had a large empire in India. Having this shortcut saved them an immense amount of money. Well, his descendant, Muhammad Ali's descendant Ismail, will not be nearly as successful as Muhammad Ali. He was educated in France. He also had that dream that Egypt was a European nation. He modernized. He proclaimed Egypt as part of Europe. But in doing so, he way overspent. He created an unpayable debt. It was so bad that the French and British sent in administrators into the Egyptian government saying, listen, we're going to take over your finances because you clearly can't pay your bills, and you're going to kind of do what we tell you to do. Ismail felt he had no choice. Egyptians didn't like this. The idea that people from other countries were telling Egyptians how to spend their money made them terrified. It created a nationalistic revolution led by the Egyptian, there's that word again, National Party. It was so bad, Ismail stepped down, his descendants stepped down, and ultimately British troops were sent in to stabilize the government in 1882, to temporarily stabilize the government, and they didn't leave until 1956. Because they took it over, that meant they're also taking over the Suez Canal. They will leave in place the facade that, hey, this is still part of the Ottoman Empire, and you still have an Egyptian Khedive who is in charge of this province of the Ottoman Empire, the Egyptian province of the... But the British were really, they were the puppeteers telling Egypt what to do. There were British troops there to keep the peace, and Egypt, in many ways, actually prospers under English rule and as a trade hub. But that resentment of the British will stay there, and to some degree, even to today. Well, so that was kind of one of the big things that changed, is England made this grab at Egypt and the Suez Canal. Well, the other one is this guy here. He is the true villain of all of this, King Leopold II. Belgium, you remember, they just broke away from the Netherlands. It feels like just yesterday. They're a new country. But Leopold, he doesn't want Belgium just to be this little, one of the Benelux countries, the low countries. He wants Belgium to be great. We need to be a great country. That means we need an empire. Come on, Belgium, let's get an empire. And the Belgians are like, meh, we invented French fries, so with mayonnaise, why would we want an empire? So he decides to create his own personal empire. Because, he's a king. Kings can have their other possessions. He creates the International, that's not spelled right, International African Association in 1876 as a private humanitarian group dedicated to the exploration of Africa, the reform of Africa, to making sure slavery has gone away. He hires explorers like Henry Morgan Stanley to explore and establish a claim to a portion of Africa. And in doing so, he creates the Congo Free State, this humanitarian, anti-slavery place under his direct control, his personal control. This was owned by him, King Leopold II, not owned by Belgium, by him. The Berlin Conference even recognized that he controlled the Congo Free State. That was his. But the real goal was the worst of the worst of the worst of European exploitations. There was a private army that was there to torture, enslave, intimidate, murder in mass, and mutilate anyone who stood in the way of Leopold making money off of the Congo Free State. Making money first off of ivory and then off of rubber. And it will make him personally a lot of money, which he does bring back to Belgium and invests in Belgium. He built a lot of great buildings. Ultimately, journalists go to the Congo Free State to investigate, to hear about the great things that are going on there, and they come back with horrific stories. Stories told by people like Joseph Conrad in his famous novel, Heart of Darkness. And he realized, this is a problem, and he ended up gifting the Congo Free State to the Belgian country before his death. So, just so you know where that is, it's this big purple area here is the Congo Free State. Well, this Berlin Conference was the brainchild of our old friend Otto von Bismarck. The new Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm, loved what Bismarck had done, creating, under the previous Kaiser, a unified Germany. But Kaiser Wilhelm dreamed bigger. He wanted a great Germany with a place in the sun, to be respected by other countries. Bismarck at first is reluctant. He wants to focus on developing Germany. Not so much. Bismarck's like, no, or the Kaiser's like, no, we need an empire. So Bismarck decides, okay, if you want an empire, here's what we're going to do. We need to take charge of it. He calls a conference in Berlin, brings in the countries, and says, here's the rules. And they hammer out the rules of how you take over Africa. One, you have to have effective occupation. That is, you have to be able to send troops in and maintain control. And you can't have any slavery or slave trade. And then everybody starts the scramble for Africa. Everybody starts grabbing whatever they can. And a lot of it is just grabbing it so someone else won't. So Germany starts acquiring empire and works with the French to block the British as many places as they can. The British move south from Egypt, north from South Africa, creates crisis after crisis. There's almost world wars between these countries almost break out, it seems like, every 5 years, whether it's in Algiers or Tunisia or in Sudan. Crisis after crisis that will help lead to and create the tensions that cause World War I. And so by the end of this is what you have. Africa divided up between these great powers. When you look at it, it's like, it doesn't seem to make much sense. Why do the Germans have this, and this, and this? And why did the French take the Sahara Desert? Did they know it was desert? What were they thinking? And Madagascar, it just seems to be random because it's just a matter of who could get there first and establish control, and who could effectively block the British from connecting their northern and southern portions of their empire. So that is the new imperialism. I hope you enjoyed it.